Hey everybody, Bryce Kuhn here with another episode of The Crowded Booth. Today, we're talking fact or fiction with the latest rumors surrounding conference realignment. All that and more on today's episode of The Crowded Booth.
Pile in here and make yourself feel at home. The Crowded Booth is coming on. The Crowded Booth with Bryce Kuhn.
Hey everybody, Bryce Kuhn here. We're on another episode of The Crowded Booth. Today, we're talking about fact or fiction with the latest rumors surrounding conference realignment. And I think it's very important to know where to go from some of the information because, listen, we all get excited when the news broke that USC and UCLA were going to move to the Big Ten. Well, the rumor mill started churning. Social media did its thing. But I think it's really important to separate fact from fiction. We're just going to tackle a couple of those things today. Before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe right down there at the bottom if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on the radio, make sure to follow us on social media at The Crowded Booth or head it over to thecrowdedbooth.com. You can subscribe for free as well and get notifications when we launch new episodes. We're excited to continue the partnership with WQE and the radio stations. But make sure, we just hit 500 subscribers over on YouTube. Give us a follow. I'm sure there's some content that you will like to see. Let's talk about this because the belief is with conference realignment is that the next major realignment may happen out west, where 4 programs could leave the Pac-12 for the Big 12 starting in August 1st, 2024. George Kliavkoff has asked schools last week, the Pac-12 commissioner, to remain patient as he explores a new media rights deal. The Big 12 could add teams. There's been rumors the SEC is standing pat, that the Big Ten wants to stand pat after this. And what does the ACC do? And I think it begs the question, there's a lot of different things that you could see what these programs could do, what could they take, and what could they do going forward? And so let's talk a little bit about that, because the first one that I want to tackle, and it's, as we watch college sports in the wake of the Big Ten expanding to 16 teams, this is kind of some of the latest news and kind of what you think. Let's first off start with this, the idea that conferences recruit schools to come into their conference. And I'll tell you right now, no conference is openly recruiting new schools. Rumors that the Big 12 was seeking the 4 Pac-12 South schools kind of caught fire last week, but that's just really not how conference realignment works. The amount of litigation and openly committing interference is a non-starter. They have to have intermediaries involved. Flyers usually come from the school, not the conference. The conference cannot openly go and do that. Now, how do those discussions begin? The circle is obviously small, group of people that do that. But the idea that a conference is actually going out there and reaching out to programs and saying, hey, let's bring you in, there's a whole bunch of litigation that has to go into that. It has to happen on the school side. That's just something that has to happen nowadays. Now, obviously, there's a lot of information that people don't hear about. Rarely does word leak until a deal is finished. Texas and Oklahoma, we learned, made it almost 2 years before a newspaper in Houston broke the news of their pending application to the SEC last July. UCLA and USC had 2 months of discussions before we even heard about this. And that really didn't happen until the two teams were already essentially accepted into the Big Ten. So simply put here, exercise caution and utilize the media literacy of what you've learned. It cannot happen openly, and I guarantee you any conversation that you have seen or it does leak, it happened well after the initial leak. Remember, almost 2 full years when Texas and Oklahoma joined, and then about 2 months, and by the time UCLA and USC was leaked, they were essentially had 1 foot in already in the Big Ten. Let's talk our next topic here, because the Notre Dame variable. What does that look like going forward? And I'll tell you this right now. Notre Dame is in absolutely zero rush to make a decision on their future. But I do believe they're going to be forced to make a decision in the next 3 to 5 years. Let's start right here. No conference, absolutely no conference, would turn down an application from Notre Dame. From the university's leadership to the athletic department, they all know that college athletics is changing, but they're not in a rush to make a change over 140 years in the making of independence within college football. Now, obviously, we know this, and if you watch the Georgia Tech show, you obviously know that Notre Dame is an ACC member in every single sport except for football and ice hockey. But that does not mean that the Irish must join the ACC. I don't think it's any secret the Big Ten is a better fit all around, and they have a longer history with Notre Dame. The conference has obviously been on the Irish's trail for decades now, and I think they're going to continue the chase until that path meets its wherever you want it to meet between Notre Dame and the Big Ten. But see, the thing about Notre Dame is I don't believe they're ready to jump on the invitation. They're contractually obligated to join the ACC right now should the school decide to join a conference. And even if Notre Dame wanted to join the Big Ten, a buyout payment to the ACC is required. Now, we've talked a lot about the buyout payment, and we're going to continue to talk about it, what the ACC would have to do, schools. But the Irish could eclipse about $100 million should it leave before 2025. And that's according to numbers produced by ESPN. Notre Dame is already, and we know this, in a fantastic position financially as a national brand. They're nearing the end of their TV contract with NBC. The network, along with the Peacock streaming service, broadcasts all of the Irish's home football games, and it pays the school out around $15 million per year. Now, the key is that this deal expires in 2025. Now, Notre Dame signed the deal back in 2020 or 2013, and they could probably earn more in that. Now, this is kind of where it also gets muddied. Notre Dame being a private institution, it's going to be a lot harder to obtain financial documents, financial information from the Fighting Irish. But this is what's interesting is a school that is likely earns less than the 14 full members of the ACC, and it's most certainly being paid less than schools in the Big Ten, $57.2 million, and the SEC, $54.3 million, which they were projected to earn in 2022 alone. The ACC paid Notre Dame $10.8 million back in the 2019-2020 year when the Irish moved over there for football. They got the full payout of $34.9 million because they were a full member in football during the 2020 COVID season. So look, we may not have all the numbers, but Notre Dame is set to earn at least less than $30 million in exchange for its televising rights. Is there more money to be made if you join a conference? Of course. It depends on the market and what Notre Dame could fetch in a new deal post-2025 and that deal with NBC. But right now, the Big Ten and the SEC are projected to pay programs more than $100 million per year within the next decade. The Fighting Irish's decision, though, should not rely on finances alone. The Irish have been locked out of a first-round bye in the most recent 12-team college football playoff proposal because of their lack of conference affiliation. And that's something that comes into this too. Would the Irish feel pressed if the college football playoff expanded to move into a conference? We already saw in that 12-team playoff they would, and that was a proposal, that they would be essentially ousted out as a first-round bye, ever getting that. And should a similar proposal to the one that was proposed earlier this season, should that come up again before 2023, it could be enough to push Notre Dame towards joining a conference. Simply put here, in my opinion, Notre Dame has time to make a decision, and it shouldn't be in a hurry. Even though there are some similar factors that are pushing the Irish in the next 3 to 5 years to potentially joining, whether it be the ACC, whether it be the Big Ten. A couple of other things I want to hit on right here very quickly, though, that I think are super, super important, is the idea that the SEC wants to remain at 16 teams. Now, there was a report earlier from SEC reporter Matt Hayes that said the powers that be in the SEC offices have no desire going beyond 16 teams after expanding Texas and Oklahoma. The SEC source told Saturday Down South that they didn't see any expansion move as threatening to them. Similar sentiments have also been shared in other avenues, but that would change with what we talked about earlier. If Notre Dame or major ACC schools such as Florida State, Clemson, or Miami were ever to come available, and the SEC could look to add. But, and this is the last one, that really seems unlikely with what the ACC has going on. ACC members are unlikely to defect because of the ironclad contract that really handcuffs any member from leaving the conference for the foreseeable future. And this is something I want to go into more depth in another episode. But the grant of rights contract that we're going to talk more about in a dedicated episode with the ACC, it's a non-starter for most schools. But let's just get in the hypotheticals. If the ACC if a school with the ACC wants to leave and do anything to join the SEC, what does that look like without the threat of interference on the SEC's part? The ACC's exit fee is the multiplier of 3, which equates as much to $150 million. That doesn't include the $300 million plus a school would pay because of the grant of right through 2036. That's a bill of nearly $500 million to be paid through 2036, which really isn't a viable option. The other scenario is, and it's very, very unlikely, if 8 members exit the SEC, if that were to happen, if 8 members exit the ACC, then the grant of rights would disappear and schools could move without financial penalty. Or you could take it to court. And while that could be so ugly, I think that it would really, really damage ACC being a power player in the college football landscape for years to come. Those are just a couple of the myths kind of going through as this topics have just ranged all over the place, really, throughout college football, through Twitter Spaces, through YouTube videos, kind of just giving you a little bit of an outlook of what would have to happen if some of these things occurred. There's a lot of fact and fiction going around in conference realignment. We want to make sure that you have the right news on that. Appreciate you tuning in today. This is just a short, quick episode. We're going to go more in depth because of our Georgia Tech fan base and our following about what does the ACC look like as a power player in college football to come. That and more on another episode of The Crowded Booth. Thanks so much for tuning in. Once again, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment. What do you think? What's a myth that you think can happen? How can conference realignment continue? Or was this just a big overreaction to 2 schools making the jump from the West Coast to the Big Ten? Let us know down in the comments below, and thanks for tuning in another episode of The Crowded Booth.